The ground shuddered as the first light of day began to break. Initially, a noise echoed through the night, akin to 100 fiery-breathing steeds charging through the gloom. Following that, war cries pierced the air, sharp and ascending, cutting through the frosty morning quietude like a razor. Seraphine stood on the porch, her feet bare, clutching a lantern that danced in the breeze, her hands trembling around a rifle she was unfamiliar with. The Comanche riders materialized from the mist, a force of 50, their faces adorned with streaks of red and ash. Leading them was a man draped in wolf furs, his gaze fixed directly on her. He lifted a hand, and the others halted. Time seemed to stand still. Then she noticed it. Behind him, astride a painted horse, was the boy she had believed she had rescued. But was this deliverance or treachery? Dust permeated everything. It settled in the crevices of the porch wood, between the pages of her well-worn Bible, and even within the folds of the single dress she wore most days. A deep blue garment with tattered sleeves, the wind carried it in from the west, dry and laden with whispers, as if it had urgent destinations and countless secrets to conceal. Seraphine resided on the outskirts of a town that shunned her. Her home featured a roof with broken shingles and a fence that leaned precariously. 30 paces beyond lay the old church bell, which no longer tolled. She kept to herself, not by choice, but because the townsfolk ensured she knew she was unwelcome. They accused her of bringing misfortune, of seeing things and of conversing with the deceased. None of it was true. Not entirely. But rumors spread faster than crops in the West, and hers had taken root too deeply to be uprooted. Once, long ago, she had walked with confidence and laughed freely. But that was before the fire, before her husband's screams turned to ash, and before the left side of her face was marred by a scar that refused to let her forget. Now she walked with a slight limp, unsteady on cold mornings, and her voice had grown softer, as if the world had pressed a finger to her lips, urging her to remain silent. The town respected that silence as well. On Sundays, she sat alone in the back pew while others filled the front rows. She was never invited to contribute to the potlucks, nor was her name ever included on the prayer lists. The preacher acknowledged her with a nod when their eyes met, but he never uttered her name from the pulpit. It was simpler that way for them. For Seraphine, it was merely another day. Children whispered as she passed, and their mothers drew them close, fearing the scar on her face might leap across the air and cling to their skin. She never reprimanded them. She remembered a time when she had been young, before the fire, before the war, and before the kind man with the crooked smile rode out one morning and never returned. He had been her world. Now she possessed only the house and the enveloping quiet. 3 years had elapsed since her husband's passing. The war had concluded months prior, yet death lingered, slow to receive the news. He had ventured out to tend to a neighbor's injured livestock, and all that remained was his hat. Blood stained the brim, an arrow pierced the crown. But there was no body, just a grim conclusion and unanswered questions that still resonated louder than gunshots in her mind. Seraphine ceased waiting for explanations. She barely spoke at all. The land didn't require noise. It demanded toil and endurance. She cultivated potatoes in one section of the yard, tended to the chickens in another. Days drifted by like wind through parched grass, slow, unremarkable, and harsh. One evening, she observed the sun's fiery descent across the horizon, a sky the color of whiskey stretching thinly over the hills. That was the first time she detected it, the harsh, irregular breathing of someone in proximity. She discovered him just beyond the chicken coop. A boy no older than 10 or 11, bare-chested and trembling beneath a thorn bush. His left leg was bound with a strip of faded cloth, soaked through with blood and grime. He gazed at her, eyes wild and alert like a cornered creature. Comanche. There was no doubt. The shape of his jaw, the bone necklace, the sharp ink markings along his shoulder. He should have fled when he saw her, but he couldn't. That leg was beyond saving. Seraphine didn't speak. She merely knelt slowly, palms open. His eyes darted between her hands, her face, and her scar. He recoiled. Most people did, but he didn't attempt to retreat. Perhaps he recognized something familiar in her own brokenness. Without a word, she lifted him. He was slight, feverish and frail, and her knees nearly buckled as she carried him inside. She laid him on the old cot her husband had once used, retrieved a damp cloth from the wash basin, and began cleaning the wound. He winced. She hushed him softly. No names were exchanged. He didn't know her tongue, and she didn't know his. But pain was a language, too. And that night, they both comprehended it. Over the following 2 days, Seraphine tended to the boy in silence. She boiled herbs, crushed roots, and tried not to ponder what would happen if someone from town noticed the unfamiliar shadow in her window. At night, she sat in the rocking chair and watched the boy's chest rise and fall. The fever abated on the second evening. He opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling as if he had seen it before in a dream. In the morning, he ate. In the afternoon, he smiled. It was the first smile she had seen in months, perhaps years. It shattered something within her, something she had buried too deeply for words. She didn't inquire why he was alone, didn't ask how far he had traveled. She simply knew he was someone's child, and someone would come searching. On the 4th day, the wind shifted its course. This time it blew in from the east, carrying a chill and a peculiar smell. Perhaps it was rain on the way, or maybe the scent of gunpowder. Seraphine stood on the porch, a tin cup in her hand, with the boy sleeping soundly behind her, his blankets tucked up to his chin. Her gaze followed the dusty road that snaked down from the hills. That was when she spotted him. Not a rider, but a walker. A solitary figure in a brown duster, his hat pulled low, moving at a deliberate pace, as if he had all the time in the world. Or maybe he had already seen it all and bore the marks to show for it. She tensed, her grip tightening on the tin cup. Strangers didn't pass through these parts without a reason. Not out here. When he reached the fence, he halted. One hand rested casually on the gate latch, the other near the revolver at his side. His face was in shadow, but as he tilted his head, the light caught his jawline, rough and weathered, with a faint cut healing just beneath his cheekbone. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Not yet, just the wind between them and the sound of a rooster crowing off-key in the distance. He slowly tipped his hat. "Ma'am." His voice was low, neither hard nor soft, just enough to carry. He glanced past her for a moment, his eyes drifting toward the window where the curtain had moved. Perhaps he saw the boy's shape. Perhaps he saw nothing at all. "I'm not here to take anything," he said. "And I certainly don't intend to sell you a Bible." That almost brought a smile to her face. Almost. "What brings you here?" she asked. Her voice was rough from lack of use, but steady. He shrugged. "Heard there was someone out this way nursing a wounded dog. Thought it might be worth investigating." She narrowed her eyes. "Are you a bounty hunter?" "If I were, would I admit it?" Silence fell again. It lingered, but not uncomfortably, like two people gauging how long they could share the same space without feeling the need to fill it. Seraphine studied him. He didn't seem afraid. And more importantly, he didn't stare at her scar the way others did. He looked at her as if she was still a person. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said. "Good," he replied. "Trouble has a way of finding people on its own." He turned as if to leave, then paused. "Do you have any water?" She nodded, gesturing with her chin toward the well behind the house. He stepped off the road and into her world without hesitation. They didn't exchange many words that day. He drank, tipped his hat again, and wandered off behind the barn, where he secured his small bedroll under a tree. No explanation, no request. He just stayed as if the land had welcomed him with open arms. The boy watched him through the curtains, saying nothing, just observing. Seraphine noticed how the man, despite being nearby, maintained a respectful distance. Not threatening, not too familiar. Later that afternoon, she found a bundle of fresh kindling on her porch. A small gesture, but it felt more significant than it was. That night, when the wind picked up again, she didn't bother to lock the door. The stranger introduced himself as Vaelrin, though he didn't provide a surname, and Seraphine didn't inquire. She assumed everyone had their reasons for leaving certain parts of their past behind. He didn't strike her as a liar, just someone who kept his secrets locked away. By the second day, he was assisting with the fence, noting that it leaned too far to the east and suggesting she reinforce it before the wind blew it down entirely. His hands bore the marks of hard labor, but he worked with a determination that suggested he was no stranger to difficult tasks. He didn't pry about the boy or her scar. However, one evening after sunset, he looked at her intently and remarked, "The world isn't kind to those it doesn't comprehend. You seem to understand that." She held his gaze. News spreads faster in small towns than lightning in a dry storm. By the third day, Mrs. Vaelrin from the church was at the general store, loudly whispering to anyone who would listen that a man had been seen walking the ridge near Seraphine's property. She claimed he had skyrend on his boots. She had always been eccentric since her husband vanished. Someone else mentioned that the sheriff hadn't been seen in over a week. Another swore they had heard drums the night before. By sunset, 3 men had ridden out to check on the widow. Seraphine spotted them before they reached the gate. She was shelling peas on the porch while Vaelrin stood quietly in the shadows of the barn, watching their approach. They kicked up dust as if they owned the land, their silhouettes lean and menacing. "Evening, Miss Seraphine," one of them called out, his smile too wide to be genuine. "We just stopped by to ensure you're safe. There's been some strange occurrences lately." She didn't stand up. "I'm fine," she replied. "We heard you might have a visitor. Thought we'd offer some company." Behind her, the door creaked slightly. She knew the boy was listening. Vaelrin stepped out then, casually wiping his hands with a rag, looking as if he had just finished repairing a wheel, not preparing for a confrontation. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but the lady already has company, and I reckon that's all she needs tonight." The 3 men didn't appreciate that. Their horses shifted nervously, and their hands moved toward their hips, but none of them were foolish enough to act rashly. The leader spat in the dirt. "You sure know how to choose your friends, Seraphine," he said. She met his gaze steadily. "So do you," she replied. They left in a cloud of resentment, and she knew they would return with more men and fewer questions. That night, the boy finally spoke. One quiet word from the dark corner of the room where he lay. "Father," he whispered. Seraphine froze, then turned slowly. He pointed to the horizon, where the wind had shifted again, carrying the sound of distant drums, low, steady, and growing closer. They arrived at dusk. Not warriors, not Comanche, but townsfolk. 3 women, 2 men, and 1 preacher. They were cloaked in borrowed virtue. Torches were unnecessary. Their voices alone were incendiary. You can't shield them, Seraphine. Mrs. Vaelrin led the charge, arms folded, hat secured too tightly over her curls. Of all people, after what transpired with your husband. Seraphine stood firm in the doorway, fists clenched at her sides. The boy was hidden behind the curtain once more. Vaelrin was nowhere to be seen. She yearned for his presence. "I didn't summon you here," she declared icily. "We're not seeking your approval," Preacher Geller interjected. His Bible dangled from one hand, a silent menace. "This land isn't yours to use for shielding wickedness." Seraphine stepped out, closing the door behind her. "Sin," she echoed. "He's a lone child, wounded and afraid. He's Skyrend." The words struck her like blows. "And you've aligned yourself with a wandering gunman, nameless and dangerous." Mrs. Vaelrin's voice dripped with malice. "You believe no one has noticed your nocturnal activities? You think your scars can conceal you forever?" Seraphine barely flinched, but that was enough. The preacher advanced, his voice rising. "You've dwelt in shadows for years, Seraphine. But this is defiance. God witnesses it. We all do." She remained silent, her gaze fixed on them, allowing the weight of their words to settle like soot, the humiliation to rise in her throat like vomit. Then Tom Kinley hurled something at her feet. A tattered doll, stitched with red thread, eyes of black. She recognized it. It had belonged to her daughter, the one they never spoke of, the one laid to rest in the distant field. Her legs gave way. "You abandoned her there," he accused. "You let her perish while you pursue phantoms in the woods." Seraphine crumpled onto the porch, breath ragged. Her hands reached out, not for the doll, but to steady herself against the sudden deluge of memories. No one offered aid. No one made a move to comfort her. They turned and departed, leaving the doll in the wake of their judgment in the cold dirt. The boy cautiously opened the door, eyes wide, silent. She averted her face so he wouldn't witness her tears. That night, she took nothing. She simply walked out the back gate, into the woods, up the hills. No destination in mind, just a way. The sky darkened behind her, clouds consuming the moon. Cold seeped into her boots, numbing her feet. Yet she didn't halt. Not when the branches lacerated her arms, not when the wolves howled from distant ridges. She walked until the pain of each breath reminded her she was still alive, and then she fell. Snow descended abruptly, a bitter April storm. Icy flakes covered her shoulders, her hair, her hands. She lay curled beneath a cedar tree, shivering. She didn't pray. She didn't hope. She awaited the cold to claim her, as it had everything else. She didn't hear him at first, didn't sense the subtle shift in the air, just the warmth of a coat draped over her shoulders. Then his voice, gentle, close. "I've been searching for you, Vaelrin." She slowly opened her eyes. He knelt beside her, rain in his hair, snow melting on his sleeves. "You didn't even say your farewells," he remarked. "That wasn't like you," she retorted, her voice dripping with bitterness. "You don't truly know me." He cocked his head to the side. "Perhaps not, but I recognize the signs of someone on the run when I see them." He didn't attempt to lift her or offer grand speeches or promises. He simply sat in silence, removed his gloves, and held her hands in his, allowing her to shiver and to breathe. "I'm not strong," she murmured, her voice barely audible, like a soft breeze. "I wished to be, but they shattered me, and I allowed it." Vaelrin didn't contradict her or rush to disagree. He gazed at her hands, marked with scars, blisters, and weathered like ancient maps. "People like us," he said softly. "We don't get to break down in public, so we crumble in secret, and then we rise again, pieced together." She blinked, her eyes meeting his. "I have no pieces left to gather." He leaned in slightly, his breath visible in the cold air. "Then allow me to sit with you while you find more." He supported her part of the way down, not by carrying her, but by walking close and letting her lean on his shoulder. Each step felt like shedding a layer of pain. Back at the cabin, the fire was still burning. The boy had kept it alive. He looked up as they returned, then retreated into the shadows, but not too far. She sank into her chair, wrapping blankets around herself. Vaelrin remained across the room, silent, just present. Later that night, when the boy finally approached, he climbed into her lap without a word. She held him, rocking him gently. And outside, Vaelrin sat on the porch, his rifle resting across his lap. Not because he anticipated trouble, but because sometimes the most perilous thing a man can do is wait with kindness. The thaw came gradually that spring, as if the land, like Martha, was uncertain whether it deserved warmth again. Snow still clung to the treetops in late April, but beneath it, something stirred. A pulse, a will, a quiet fire. She woke before dawn most mornings, not out of necessity, but out of desire. The boy was still asleep on the cot Vaelrin had constructed from scrap lumber and rope. He slept peacefully now, no longer flinching at every sound or plagued by feverish dreams. Seraphine stirred the embers in the hearth and added fresh wood. The soft crackle was her favorite sound these days. Not long after, Vaelrin would enter from the woods, axe over his shoulder, his beard thick with morning frost. He never knocked. He simply entered as if he had always belonged. And somehow, over the weeks, he did. They built things together, small things at first. A sturdy fence, a new hinge for the back door, shelves above the hearth. She found her hands steadier with a purpose. Theo's limp didn't disappear, but her stride grew stronger. The whispers in town still lingered like dust, but fewer people dared approach the gate anymore. Not since Vaelrin started leaving carved bullets on the fence posts, a silent warning. They began trading again, smoked venison for flower seeds for cloth. She didn't smile in town, but she stopped lowering her head. The boy stayed hidden during their trips, but he was learning English. From Seraphine, from Vaelrin, from eavesdropping on the world without ever fully engaging in it. One afternoon, as the sun began to set behind the cottonwoods, Vaelrin rested against the porch railing, observing Seraphine gently brushing the boy's hair with a touch as soft as a breeze. "Have you ever considered leaving?" he inquired. She didn't glance back. "Every single day," he responded with a slow nod. "Yet, you remain." "I remain," she affirmed, "because if I depart now, they emerge victorious." He offered no reply, merely gazing at her, the long scar on her neck glowing in the firelight, a remnant of old sorrows. "I used to be embarrassed by it," she suddenly confessed. "My limp, my face, my silence. I believed I had lost all the qualities that defined me as a woman." Vaelrin moved closer, his voice hushed. "The truth is, I never saw you as shattered. I saw you as a blazing inferno." She met his gaze, her eyes steady, weary, but now illuminated from within. "Perhaps it's time I ceased waiting to feel complete." They embarked on something monumental. The following morning, the land behind the house was level and fertile, the grass lush, the soil dark. Vaelrin unearthed old plow parts near the barn. Together they etched furrows into the earth. A horse ranch, they decided, or something akin to it. The boy chuckled for the first time, watching Vaelrin pursue a defiant colt through the creek. That laughter, brief and untamed, lingered with Seraphine throughout the night, but fire cast shadows, and by the second week of May, they arrived. Vaelrin had departed at dawn to purchase nails and molasses. Seraphine stayed behind to care for the boy's bruised ankle. She heard the hoofbeats before she spotted the riders. 3 of them, clad in dusty coats, their expressions flat. Lawmen or something similar. The leader was tall, his gray beard sharp, his eyes piercing with judgment. He dismounted with a familiar sneer, the kind men wore when they believed they possessed all the answers. "Seraphine Strider," he declared, "I didn't anticipate finding you nestled in a cozy home with a savage and a phantom." She offered no response, standing her ground. "You recognize who I am?" he inquired. She nodded once. "Marshal Rockharrow. Vaelrin mentioned you." He chuckled. "Did he reveal that he abandoned a company wagon train? Left 2 men to perish so he could vanish into the woods like a coward." Seraphine didn't react, but the boy behind her clutched her skirt. Rockharrow leaned in closer. "He's not the man you believe him to be." "Never was." That evening, Vaelrin returned to find her perched on the porch steps, her eyes red but composed. "You anticipated his arrival," she stated. He nodded. I suspected he would. It was merely a matter of time. "Is it true," she asked, "about the wagon train?" Vaelrin crouched beside her, his hands resting on his knees. "It is, but not as he portrays it." She awaited his explanation. "I was commanded to eliminate a Comanche family encamped near the river. They hadn't harmed anyone, merely resided too close for comfort. 2 of our men proceeded ahead. By the time I arrived, the deed was already done." He paused. "I couldn't bear it. I buried the deceased, left my badge on the captain's saddle, and walked away." Seraphine regarded him, her eyes filled with turmoil and lucidity. "You've been fleeing ever since." He nodded. "Until now." The boy emerged from the house, clutching a wooden horse that Vaelrin had crafted for him. He wordlessly placed it on Vaelrin's lap before climbing into Seraphine's embrace. She didn't request Vaelrin's departure, and he didn't flee. That evening, they prepared not for battle or capitulation, but for honesty. The following morning, she ventured into town alone, her hair neatly braided, dressed modestly, with a rifle secured across her back. She strode directly into the saloon where Rockharrow was drinking with 2 deputies. "Are you after Vaelrin?" she inquired. "Come and take him. But heed this warning. If you enter my property with weapons drawn, you won't leave it unchanged." Rockharrow chuckled. "Are you threatening a marshal, Miss Strider?" he asked. "No," she replied. "I'm assuring you that the hill behind my cabin has space for 3 more crosses, if necessary." She exited before they could respond. The room fell silent, and no one pursued her. Back at the ranch, Vaelrin was digging holes for fence posts. The boy led a young colt across the newly cleared field. Seraphine sat beside the garden plot, planting seeds in neat, orderly rows. "I never imagined I'd build anything again," she murmured. "But perhaps that was just another falsehood they instilled in me." Vaelrin glanced over. "You're not the same woman I encountered," he observed. She met his gaze steadily. "No," she affirmed. "I'm stronger." They arrived at dawn, 50 riders, silent and shadowy on horseback. There were no war cries, no wasted movements, just the steady drumbeat of hooves over the thawing earth as the horizon blazed with orange light. The Comanche had not come for vengeance. They had come for the boy. And his father led the charge. Seraphine stood at the gate, rifle across her back, her throat tight with tension. Vaelrin stood beside her, his jaw clenched but his eyes resolute. The boy clung to her leg, barefoot and trembling, but he did not hide. When the riders halted just beyond the fence, their leader dismounted, tall and broad, his braided hair streaked with silver. He looked not at Vaelrin, not at the land, but at Seraphine, and then slowly he gazed down at his son. No one spoke until the boy released Seraphine's hand and stepped forward. He spoke in Comanche, his small voice steady. The man knelt, and Seraphine didn't comprehend the words, but she understood the moment. The father embraced the boy, pressing his face into his shoulder, not as a warrior, but as a man who believed he had lost everything. After a moment, the man stood and looked at Seraphine again. This time he nodded, not out of gratitude or politeness, but out of acknowledgement. She had saved his kin, and for that she would forever be a part of his tale. Then, unexpectedly, he stepped aside and gestured to the boy, allowing him to choose. The boy turned, his eyes flickering between the tall warrior and the woman who had become his sanctuary. His gaze lingered on Seraphine, then on Vaelrin. And finally, he took Seraphine's hand. She felt his small fingers slip between hers, warm and sure. In that instant, 50 warriors bowed their heads in silent accord. No words, no ceremony, just a truth exchanged between people who had lost and found things too sacred to articulate. They lingered until the sun rose above the ridge. Then the riders disappeared back into the hills, like smoke dissipating into the wind. 3 days later, the town assembled at the chapel, not for a funeral, but for a wedding, a quiet one. No music, no flowers, just hands clasped over worn pews and silent tears from those who finally saw her for who she truly was. Vaelrin didn't don a suit. She didn't wear white, but there was a necklace of hawk feathers tied around her wrist, a gift from the boy. And when they kissed, the light filtering through the stained glass illuminated the scar on her neck, not to shame her, but to honor her. The townsfolk rarely spoke of it. Some still averted their gazes, but others, the baker, the blacksmith, even the woman who once labeled her cursed, began to nod in the streets, then greet her. Small fissures in old stone. The ranch expanded, fences multiplied. A smokehouse was constructed, and in the spring wild colts galloped through the creek bed, their manes glistening in the golden light. They named the boy Gareth, after a man Vaelrin had once laid to rest with her own hands, a name to honor the past and start anew. One winter evening, Seraphine sat by the fire, observing Vaelrin repair a saddle. Gareth lay curled in a blanket, softly humming an old Comanche melody. Seraphine glanced at the window, snow falling gently and slowly beyond the glass. The world was hushed. "Did you ever think we'd reached this point?" Vaelrin inquired, looking up. "No," she replied, gently stroking Gareth's hair. "But I stopped waiting for someone else to save me." Vaelrin reached for her hand, holding it not tightly, but as if he'd never let go. Outside, the snow thickened, but inside, the fire burned steadily. If this story touched you, give it a like and tell us in the comments. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Subscribe to Frontier Stories and join us as we continue to tell stories of hope, resilience, and the beautiful, messy truth of Wild West.